It's November 9th, 1888. We're in Whitechapel, in East London, where Thomas Bower is about to make a grim discovery. Bower is a tough man, by the way. He's been a soldier, he's travelled the world, and he's also worked as a rent collector in London's East End for years. So he's well acquainted with the seamier side of life. But what he'll find at number 13 Miller's Court on that November morning will break him completely. Inside her modest room, on sheets saturated with blood, lies the body of Mary Jane Kelly. Her abdomen is torn open, organs have been removed, and each one has been arranged around her in careful order. It's a truly shocking sight, and it transforms Bower into a nervous wreck. He can barely speak as he reaches the police station on nearby Commercial Street. But 6 panicked words tell the officers what they need to know. Another one. Jack the Ripper. Awful. Mary Jane Keller was the last of the so-called canonical 5. These are the 5 women believed to have died at the hands of Jack the Ripper. The barbaric killing of Mary Jane Kelly is traditionally where the trail goes cold. This is the point at which Jack the Ripper slips out of the history books and into the realms of myth and legend, leaving behind a string of horribly mutilated corpses and a whole lot of speculation and guesswork. And for close to 140 years, this is the way it's been. Until now. In 2025, more than 137 years after Jack the Ripper claimed his first victim, the criminologist Professor David Wilson claimed he'd solved the mystery. For Wilson, the killer was none other than Aaron Kosminski, a Polish hairdresser living in Whitechapel. Wilson used a combination of DNA testing, geo-profiling techniques, and analysis of police records to arrive at his conclusion. But rather than case closed, some questions do remain unanswered. So, has the mystery really been solved, or is this just another twist in a desperately grim tale? Speculation on the true identity of Jack the Ripper could fill a book. In fact, it has already filled plenty of books. Was barrister and schoolteacher Montague Druitt the killer? Or perhaps it was royal physician Sir William Gole? Was it Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's own grandson? Or was it Charles Dodgson, better known as author Lewis Carroll? As a child, I went to school in a town called Thorpe-le-Soken, and it was a bit of a local myth that one of the graves marked Jack the Ripper's coffin. Professor David Wilson believes it was none of these people. Instead, it was Polish barber Aaron Kosminski. And he has proof. Kosminski was born in Kłodawa in Poland in 1865. Then part of the Russian Empire, Poland was not a safe place for Jewish families like the Kosminskis in the late 19th century. And so they emigrated, arriving in England in the 1880s. Kosminski was working as a hairdresser in Whitechapel in the late 1880s, just when Jack the Ripper was embarking on his killing spree. His first brush with the law came in 1889, when he received a fine for failing to muzzle his dog. The following year, he seems to have had a mental breakdown and was placed in the Mile End Old Town workhouse by his own brother. In 1891, he was accused of threatening his sister with a knife and spent 3 years at Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum and then in Livingston Asylum. He was said to experience auditory hallucinations and paranoia. According to records, Kosminski's condition was caused by, quote, self-abuse, which is believed to refer to self-pleasuring. I can't say the word on YouTube, I'm sorry. In any case, he remained in and out of psychiatric institutions until his death in 1919. Wilson is not the first investigator to suggest Kosminski as the murderer. In fact, Wilson's work builds upon recent DNA testing and analysis. In 2014, businessman and researcher Russell Edwards claimed to have found conclusive DNA evidence that Kosminski was responsible for the murders in Whitehall. Edwards had found a valuable artifact for sale at auction. It was the shawl of Catherine Eddowes, the third suspected victim of Jack the Ripper. Edwards believed this was the shawl that Eddowes had died in. It was a macabre purchase, even for someone with a historical interest in the case, but for Edwards, it was more than that. It was a clue that could unlock the murder. After purchasing the shawl for £100, Edwards met with the curator of the Black Museum at New Scotland Yard. The The curator suggested Aaron Kosminski as a lead. While investigating the murders, police had considered Kosminski a suspect, but without evidence to prove it, no arrests were made. So, Edwards had an idea. He would collect DNA from the shawl and use modern techniques to prove or disprove Kosminski's guilt once and for all. Working with Dr. Jari Lehelainen at Liverpool John Moores University, he began to examine the shawl for DNA. The shawl was covered in the victim's blood, so finding Catherine Eddowes' DNA was easy. But what about Kosminski's DNA? Well, on closer inspection, Lehelainen and Edwards found other excretions on the shawl. This was, they believed, to be the climactic juice of her attacker. Again, sorry, I can't use the real words sometimes. In Edwards' own words, the process was painstaking. Samples were degraded and results were lost or delayed, but gradually the work progressed. Mitochondrial DNA was extracted from the shawl and compared with that of direct descendants of Catherine Eddowes and of Aaron Kosminski's family line. After months of testing and retesting, the results showed matches. So, the mystery was solved. It wasn't the Queen's grandson, or her doctor, or any of the lawyers or authors, or butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers who'd been suspected. It was a Polish hairdresser in the grips of a mental breakdown. Now, the families of his victims wanted justice. They wanted Aaron Kosminski formally named in court as the perpetrator of these shocking crimes. Karen Miller is a living descendant of Catherine Eddowes, and it was Karen who provided the DNA match for Catherine so long after her death. As Miller told the Daily Mail in 2024, "We've got the proof, now we need the inquest to legally name the killer. It would mean a lot to me, to my family, to a lot of people, to finally have this crime solved." But was the crime really solved? Despite the apparent bulletproof evidence, not everyone was convinced. When a team of forensic scientists at Innsbruck Medical University reviewed the paper, they noticed something missing. Lehelainen and Edwards had not published the genetic sequences of the living relatives of either the suspect or the victim. Instead, they provided a colourful graphic to illustrate their findings. They claimed there was a legal reason for this, the UK's Data Protection Act. But Innsbruck forensic scientist Walter Parson was suspicious. Parson said, "Without this data, the reader cannot judge the result. I wonder where science and research are going when we start to avoid showing results, but instead present coloured boxes." Other experts were concerned about the nature of the tests themselves. Another Innsbruck Medical University specialist, Hansi Weissensteiner, believes the results don't tell us anything at all. He says that mitochondrial DNA matches are common. These tests are used to rule out a suspect who doesn't match, not confirm one that does. For geneticist Adam Rutherford, the team made alarming mistakes when reporting their findings. He described how the research was based on the presence of a rare allele or genetic mutation, but this mutation was actually mislabeled. They had the allele as 314.1C, which is rare, but it turned out to be 315.1C, which has a frequency of about 90% in Europe. Lehelainen also claimed a 1 out of 290,000 estimate based on the 314.1C, which is impossible because the database it was drawn from only has 34,617 entries. To put it simply, thousands of other people living in London at the same time may have shared the same mitochondrial DNA traces as Kosminski. And there's also the shawl itself to consider. Edwards brought the shawl at auction in 2007, 111 years after Eddowes was brutally murdered. Assuming that the shawl actually is the one that Eddowes was wearing on the night of her death, the risk for contamination over the following century is enormous. A previous owner of the shawl said he'd left the clothing in his car for a number of years and also kept it in his shed. There's even a picture of Edwards holding it with his bare hands. It's possible that Eddowes' relatives also handled the shawl, further contaminating it. As for traces of Kosminski's DNA, this is also problematic. The perpetrator of the Whitechapel murders was certainly a rampant misogynist who hated women, and there was likely a sexual aspect to the crimes, but there's no suggestion of any actual load at any of the crime scenes. So finding traces of Kosminski's DNA on her shawl doesn't really fit with the pattern. What it does fit with, however, is her career as a sex worker. Kosminski may have simply been a patron of Eddowes, and this would explain the presence of his DNA. When Adam Rutherford interviewed Llewellyn for BBC Radio 4, he asked him whether this evidence would stand up in a modern murder trial, to which he replied, "No, it would not be conclusive in a modern court." Rutherford concluded that the whole thing is a joke. There isn't a historian or curator on earth who would consider the provenance of the shawl acceptable. What follows is just bad science. How it made it through peer reviews is a mystery. But not everyone thought the research was a joke. Criminologist David Wilson acknowledged the flaws in the findings, but also felt it gave him something to build on. By 2025, he believed he'd cracked the case. Wilson applied modern geoprofiling techniques to the Whitechapel murders case. This involves mapping the pattern of murder sites and cross-referencing this data with the known whereabouts of the suspect. When the sites were mapped, it was found that Kosminski's Sion Square home was right at the centre of the area, and that all of the murders took place within a half a mile of where Kosminski was living. For Wilson, this means the evidence against Kosminski is now damning. As well as Edwards' DNA testing and Wilson's geoprofiling, there are also police and psychiatric reports from the time. A Metropolitan Police file from the 1890s stated that Kosminski had a great hatred of women, especially prostitutes, and strong homicidal tendencies. The fact that the assaults all take place on weekends was also taken into account. Kosminski would have been working during the week and so would only have had time to murder people on Friday evenings or the weekend. This may be circumstantial evidence, but Wilson believes that, when taken all together, everything points to Kosminski as the culprit. In fact, Wilson believes that Kosminski actually killed 6 people, not just the canonical 5. Martha Tabron was murdered on August 7, 1888, 3 weeks before the Ripper's traditional first victim, Mary Ann Nichols. Tabron had been stabbed 39 times, but her body bore none of the hallmarks associated with Jack the Ripper's other victims. Despite this, Wilson believes Kosminski murdered her too. But really, why does any of this matter now? Why so much time and energy being expended on solving a 140-year-old murder case? Well, firstly, it matters from a legal point of view. There are literally dozens of people whose legacies are forever tarnished by speculation that they were Jack the Ripper. While all of these suspects are long dead, they do deserve to have their names cleared if new evidence comes to light. It also makes sense from a historical point of view. The Whitechapel murders are an important part of the history of London and Britain as a whole. They exposed the grim conditions of urban life at the end of the 19th century and the vulnerability of people on the margins of society. Solving the mystery offers a valuable conclusion to something that has fascinated historians for more than a century. But perhaps most importantly, it matters from a human point of view. When Catherine Eddowes' descendant Karen Miller spoke to the Mail, she said, "The name Jack the Ripper has become sensationalised. It's gone down in history as this famous character. It's all been about him, this iconic name. But people have forgotten about the victims who did not have justice at the time." And of course, she's right. Jack the Ripper has become a part of London folklore. He's become a kind of spooky boogeyman, a mythical figure along the lines of Bram Stoker's Dracula. The air of mystery, the slasher-fic pseudonym, and the creepy Dickensian setting, all this has combined to create a sort of cartoonish villain, someone who's almost supernatural and can evade detection and capture. In fact, though, the true Jack the Ripper is none of this. He's just a murderer who killed vulnerable women in acts of astonishing savagery. Identifying the killer means demystifying him. It means exposing him for what he really was. A flesh-and-blood man, hell-bent on murdering and dissecting innocent people. Because there's no way of getting away from it. These were truly stomach-churning crimes. Jack the Ripper is most closely associated with a murder spree that lasted less than 3 months and left 5 women dead, their bodies horribly mutilated. And even today, these are really disturbing cases. At around 2:30 a.m. on August 31st, 1888, 43-year-old Mary Ann Nichols was spotted by a friend on Osborne Street in Whitechapel. Nichols appeared to be drunk. When her friend tried to convince her to return to her lodgings, Nichols refused. Just over an hour later, the butchered body of Nichols was discovered on Bucks Row. She had been killed by a deep slash wound across her throat. As I said earlier, some of the details are too extreme for YouTube, but there is an uncensored version on our Patreon. After her death, it was estimated that the killer had spent 4 or 5 minutes mutilating her body. 9 days later, on August the 8th, 1888, the body of Annie Chapman was discovered in nearby Hanbury Street. A witness reported hearing a woman in distress at around 5:15 a.m. but did not investigate. Chapman was discovered at 6 a.m. Chapman had met the same wretched end as Nichols, her throat slashed, and then disemboweled. Then, several weeks after the murder of Annie Chapman, the Metropolitan Police received the now famous Dear Boss letter. The anonymous letter concluded, "My knife's so nice and sharp. I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." For the first time, the police had a name for the killer, and it was a name that was associated with the case for years to come. But just days after the letter was received, the Ripper struck again. Just after midnight on September 30th, Swedish-born Elizabeth Stride was seen speaking to a man on Berner Street. She was heard to say, "No, not tonight, some other night." Just half an hour later, Stride was dead. She was found in the street outside the Working Man's Educational Club on Berners Street, blood pouring from a wound in her neck. She'd had her throat cut. Unlike the other murder victims, Stride had not been mutilated further. However, less than an hour later, the killer claimed another victim. Just 45 minutes after the discovery of Elizabeth Stride, a policeman in Mitre Square found another body, that of Catherine Eddowes. The murder had only just taken place. On a sweep of the square, only 15 minutes earlier, the policeman had spotted nothing untoward. Understanding that the killer must still be nearby, he ran and knocked on a nearby house. "For God's sake, mate, come to my assistance." Catherine Eddowes had been killed with a slash to the throat. Her face had been significantly disfigured, and the killer had sliced open her abdomen. It was noted that her right ear had also been slashed, and the lobe had been removed. This piece of evidence was key to proving the legitimacy of the Dear Boss letter, as the letter writer had stated, "The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off." But while all of Jack the Ripper's victims were slain with stomach-churning barbarity, the most disturbing process was reserved for his next victim, 25-year-old Mary Jane Kelly. Kelly was originally from Ireland, and little is known about her early life. She lived in Wales for a time, and despite her young age, had already been married and widowed. By 1884, she was living in London and had worked as a lady of the night for affluent clients in London's West End. Sometime between the 8th and 9th of November 1888, Kelly was murdered at her lodgings in Miller's Court. The rent collector, Thomas Bower, found her eviscerated body lying in bed at around 10:45 on the morning of November 9th. Unlike the other four victims, Kelly had not been killed in the street, but in a private room, and this gave the murderer more time to conduct his grim work without fear of discovery. According to the post-mortem, the killer had completely opened Kelly's abdomen, removing the organs within. Mercifully, Kelly was already dead, while the Ripper eviscerated her. Like the others, she'd been killed by a slash to the throat, dying quickly. The extent to which Kelly was mutilated has led to speculation that the Ripper was some sort of medical professional, an expert surgeon practicing on his victims. But the surgeon Thomas Bond disagreed with this. After examining the bodies, he concluded, in each case, the mutilation was inflicted by a person who had no scientific nor anatomical knowledge. In my opinion, he does not even possess the technical knowledge of a butcher or horse slaughterer. The statement from Thomas Bond is often conveniently forgotten when we consider the Ripper case. There's a tendency to view the murderer as a surgical specialist carrying out sophisticated experiments on his victims, but in fact, there's never been any evidence to suggest this. Again, this is something that tallies with Kosminski's backstory. He was not a surgeon and did not have any medical background. He was a hairdresser. However, I don't think that we can categorically say that the mystery is solved, because there are still a few things that don't quite add up. For example, the Metropolitan Police record contains just one single mention of Kosminski. This is the memorandum that outlined his hatred of women and his homicidal nature. But this record doesn't mention Kosminski's forename. This has prompted author Martin Fido to speculate that the memorandum may refer to someone else, a man named David Cohen, also known as Nathan Kaminski. Cohen was another psychiatric patient with a long and well-documented history of violence. Aaron Kosminski, on the other hand, was described as harmless in his psychiatric records. These records also noted that Kosminski spoke mainly Yiddish and was not comfortable conversing in English. While the Dear Boss letter does contain lots of grammar and spelling mistakes, it's written confidently and in conversational, colloquial English. If the letter is genuine, as it's believed to be, it's unlikely Kosminski wrote it himself. And this is also before we consider the DNA evidence that many experts still find highly controversial. So, has the case been solved? Not completely. There are still questions that need to be answered. But what we do have is an interesting new development in perhaps the most famous unsolved murder case in British history, one that may bring us a step closer to some form of justice for the victims' families. Justice that is, frankly, long, long overdue.